Good morning, members. Good morning, members. Welcome to the first and annual meeting of the Housing, Planning and Environment Overview Scrutiny Committee. My name is Julie Connor and I'm Head of Governance and Scrutiny for the GMCA. And I'll just open the meeting and take us up to the point of nominating a chair. We've got apologies today from Councillors Gunther, Preston, Wilson, Larkin, Eamon Boylan and Dr Carolyn Wilkins. If we can welcome Councillor Fred Walker and Councillor Bernard Sharp, who have agreed to attend as substitutes, so that we have a quorum meeting. Item number 2 is to note the membership of the Scrutiny Committee for the 18-19 municipal year, and the members there are listed in your pack. Is that noted? Thank you. Item number 3 is appointment of a chair of the Scrutiny Committee for 2018-19. Can I invite nominations, please? Thank you. Can I take any more?
I'll nominate Lisa Smart and I will declare the nomination on the interest of gender balance and political balance on the police committee.
Okay, is the nomination of Councillor Smart seconded? Thank you. Without further ado, Lisa is appointed as chair of the Scrutiny Committee. If you'd like to take the chair. Thank you, members.
Thank you very much, members. Particular welcome to all of the new members of this committee. We've had a 2/3 turnover, so thank you very much for joining our ranks. The next item on the agenda is the appointment of the Vice Chair. I'm very happy to nominate Councillor Andrew Morgan for the Vice Chair. That's seconded by Councillor Winstanley. Are there any other nominations? Then that's agreed. Item 5 is the Members' Code of Conduct and Annual Declaration of Interest form. Does anybody want to say anything about this, Susan?
It's just to note that as you're acting on the behalf of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority as opposed to your district roles, you're just required to fill in the declaration form, and if you could submit it to Jen, the DEM Services, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, before we go on to item 6, I'm going to ask all members to move their name cards so that they're facing me, please, particularly those who are new, because I don't know all of your names yet. Okay, item 6 is the terms of reference. These were in the papers. We're asked to note the terms of reference. Are they noted? And there is a set of proposed dates and times of future meetings. Does anybody have any comment or counter proposals to the proposed dates and times? Or Susan, do you want to explain why these have been proposed?
So we've worked very hard to both try and standardise the day in which the committee meets. So a Thursday last year it met on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we thought it was in response to member feedback. We thought it would be more helpful just to keep a consistent day, and the date has been scheduled to coincide the week before the Greater Manchester Combined Authority papers get issued, so that gives you the best chance of getting upstream of a lot of decisions that the Combined Authority takes. The reason that it flipped from daytime to evening meetings was in response to the wishes of the committee last year. You're very welcome to discuss that, and also to discuss the time slots if you want to shift the time slightly. I think if you did go there will be some clashes if you change some of the meetings, but we can work. We've got a good run at trying to sort that out in advance.
So we went last time for a 10:30 start so that certain members avoided rush hour traffic, which they were keen to do. Are members content to stick with a 10:30 start? Councillor Robinson. Yeah, could you use your microphone, please, Councillor? Thank you.
Can actually shout, you know. Yeah, I'm, as far as I'm concerned, I'm happy with the dates. My problem is, especially the winter months, the nighttime ones, because I have a problem on the route that I travel. Sometimes there's no escalators, there's no lifts, so if I'm going home in the dark, it's, and one time last year I was in that situation when I was left at Radcliffe. So I'm a bit more worried this year about the nighttime ones in the winter.
Are you requesting that we consider changing them to daytime meetings? The winter
Just the
ones?
evening one to the maybe the afternoon.
Okay.
Just the, I think that's only, I think it applies to about three meetings.
3 meetings. Okay. Does any other member of the committee have anything to say about that? I've got Councillor Booth and then I'll bring in Councillor Winter. Councillor Booth.
The 10:30 start would be better for me if it was an 11 start, given my travelling difficulties. I'm having to get up at the crack of dawn and then get a taxi through rush hour. That half an hour would make a big difference for me personally, if that's acceptable to the committee.
Councillor Winstanley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not unsympathetic to the problems of travelling, especially in winter, and people being stranded at stations. My only point would be, though, that in terms of would we be able to change some of those? So if we're moving the winter ones to daytime, would there be a quid pro quo in terms of the summer ones? Because I'm conscious of the fact that I'm going to struggle to do any daytime meetings, which would also include late afternoons. So the 6 o'clock start time for me is fine. But obviously in August, September and October, we've got 3 daytime meetings, which I know that I'm not going to be able to make. If we then change some of the winter ones to daytime as well, it's effectively reeling me out of this committee. I might as well go back in the pool.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Julie, who's going to work out how to square this circle.
Just make a suggestion. If we do the flip, as Councillor Winstanley has suggested, it will create clashes for members with their meetings back in local councils. I'm quite happy to go offline and have a conversation with Councillor Robinson in terms of how we can help you travel from Radcliffe or from here from home in on those evening times, if that would be suitable. If we have a conversation offline, how we can facilitate that and your travel, would that be?
Because that's one of the issues we as a committee should be looking at, is that people aren't able to travel late at night within Greater Manchester. So it's a really valid point that you've raised, Councillor Robinson. Yes, and it was a valid point then as well. We may return to some themes that we covered last year as well. I don't think all the problems we discussed have been solved yet. Okay, what I think we should do then is, it seems there's general... what I'm going to do, Councillor Sharp, is make a proposal, and then I'll bring you in, is that we agree the dates of the meetings, which seem to have general agreement, and then we'll take maybe the discussion about times offline. Councillor Sharp, I'll bring you in, please.
I just wanted to say that some members, and I don't know how many, may well be privileged or misfortunate to have a piece of plastic which puts you into trouble in Greater Manchester after 9:30. And I'm very anxious to save as much money as I possibly can. That's part of my background, which comes from my district. If I come beforehand, I've got to leave, I've got to pay for the tram. I may have to pay for parking if I come in the car. And I think to leave it as it is perhaps the best thing at the moment, and review it when you get to the time if you think it's got to change. But that's one of the reasons why I am happy with this sort of time. I can use this magic piece of plastic, and it does help. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Okay, I'm keen that we try and accommodate as many wishes of the committee as possible while being as inclusive as possible, because we have some members who work, some members who have other commitments, some members who have particular travel requirements. It seems that we had a council proposal from Councillor Booth about moving the start time to 11 o'clock, so moving more towards the middle of the day. I don't know if those members who work have any difference between a 10:30 or an 11 o'clock start. Okay, that seems to have general agreement then, an 11 o'clock start. With that in mind, does the committee agree with the proposed dates and moving the 10:30 to 11 o'clocks of these Is that agreed? And we'll talk to Councillor Robinson separately about her particular travel issues. Okay. Now on to the ordinary business of the meeting. There is no urgent business that I'm aware of. Does any member or indeed officer have any declarations of interest to make? Councillor Holland.
Yeah, item 13, because I'm a member of Transport for Greater Manchester.
Councillor Holland doesn't need to leave or anything like that. No. Lovely, that's duly noted, thank you. Do we, any other declarations of interest? Okay, do members agree, particularly those who were here last time, with the minutes of the last meeting? Can we approve those as an accurate record? That's agreed, and there are no matters arising from the previous minutes. One thing to just update members on, the only outstanding action is for TFGM to provide further information on the reduction number of trips that will be required to achieve the necessary improvements in air quality. This is expected around the 30th of July 2018, I'm told. Okay, item 10, we welcome some members of the waste team, I think at the bottom of our desks here. So it's item 10, Waste and Resource Strategy. We've got Councillor Alex Gonottis, who is the Green City Portfolio Lead and leader of Stockport Council, who's here as the political lead on this. We've got Sarah Meller, who is the officer here who's representing. And Michelle Lynch, who is here to talk about some elements of this report. Great. I'm very happy to hand over to you, and then we'll take questions at the end from members.
Okay, thanks very much. For the benefit of those members who are new to this committee, what my GM portfolio incorporates is the low carbon agenda, air quality, and basically quality of life in relation to the natural environment. And one of the many benefits, I think, of folding the Waste Disposal Authority into the combined authority, which took place a number of months ago, is that we can forge stronger links between the waste agenda and the wider GM agenda. And I think there are stronger links to be made in terms of waste with my portfolio and with my agenda, especially when it comes to the waste and resource strategy, because if you think about reducing carbon emissions, you think about environmental considerations, this is something that really I should be taking a very keen interest in terms of my agenda. So the point of this report coming today is to set out to you the work that started in relation to the GM review of the waste and resource strategy. The strategy we have in GM needs to be reviewed every 5 years. This review has been delayed slightly because of a lack of clarity from both the European Union and also national policy when it comes to waste. We now have that clarity, and therefore we're proceeding with this review of strategy. The key things we were looking for were targets and plans coming from the EU, and that's set out in this paper, and the government's 25-year environment plan, which means that we can now do a full job of this review. It's led by the Waste and Resource team that was previously the Greater Manchester Waste Disposal Authority, and Sarah, who's the Head of Corporate Services, will be taking you through a presentation in a moment. But I just want to pick out what I think are the most important elements of this report. First of all, paragraph 5.4 summarises, especially for the benefit of those who are new to this committee, the changes over the past year from us pulling out of the PFI contracts and the current temporary contracts that we're in with Viridor. 5.6 sets out the current policy objectives that we have in the waste strategy. In terms of the table, it sets out some interesting new things that we're doing, such as the procurement of the installation of a solar farm, showing how we're doing things differently in Greater Manchester and trying to get ahead of the curve. And then finally, from section 7 onwards, you can see the detail of the government's 25-year environment plan, England's resource and waste strategy, and the Greater Manchester strategy that you should be aware of that we launched last year, and how that dovetails with this agenda and should be used as an influencer to the new strategy. And importantly, we're going to have extensive consultation with all key stakeholders on this new strategy over the next 3 months, and then we will come back to you in the autumn with a draft strategy for your consideration, and we'll be looking to implement it at the end of this financial year. Sarah.
Sorry. Yeah, so we're here today just to let you know sort of what we do as a waste and resources team. We had a strategy which was in 2012, which set out really ambitious targets of how we wanted to move the waste agenda forward, which really focused on minimising as environmental impact, focusing on sustainability, and trying to get those recycling targets moving in the right direction. As has been explained, we've just recently come out of a PFI contract, and we're in interim arrangements at the moment, and there'll be some slides which cover what we're doing in that interim situation in order then to start as new contract arrangements, which is scheduled for April 2019. Now, I'll discuss what we're doing as a partnership, because whilst we used to be the Greater Manchester Waste Disposal Authority, but we're very conscious that we can't do anything without district's input. This is very much a collaboration between waste collection authorities and how then the solutions which we have to dispose of that waste within Greater Manchester. I'm going to hand over to Michelle now, who's going to talk a bit about what his current strategy is at the moment and how we deal with that.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so as a waste and resources team, what we're trying to achieve is zero waste. Our main aims through this are looking at the waste hierarchy, which you can see on the right-hand side. So our aim is to save resources, to reduce the amount of waste that we all create, to increase recycling, and to produce green energy with disposal right at the bottom. That's the last resort. So we do this in a number of ways. As Sarah said, we work in partnership together, and we have close relationships with our 9 district councils to achieve key targets that we have. We have our technical solution. So since the start of the PFI contract, £621 million investment in a raft of facilities to provide an environmentally friendly solution. And we have our behavioural change programme, which is looking to change the behaviour of our residents. We've got a new strategy, which I'll come on to, with 7 key aims. And it's really about improving access to information, changing behaviour through targeted campaigns, through advertising, key messages and calls to action. Okay, so the partnership. So as I said, we work closely with our district authorities, closely with our colleagues, our stakeholders and our contractors, and we really are striving to promote zero waste and to achieve our targets. To help us with the strategy, we endorsed a 3-pronged approach, which was to reduce residual waste capacity, which all of our 9 districts have now done, whether that be to decrease residual collections or to reduce the capacity of the bin size, and that's now been completed. We have our behavioural change 5-year strategy, and we also have targeted enforcement through Section 46 legislation. Now, although it is complicated legislation and it is hard to enforce, and every district does use that legislation differently. So what I think we need is really a common policy and stronger powers in this area to really help us to achieve our aims. So as I mentioned, the technical solution, £621 million investment, so current infrastructure, raft of facilities, 20 household waste recycling centres, 5 MBTs, we've got our transfer loading stations, materials recovery facility, IVCs that turn our food and garden waste into compost, and our energy recovery facility. And that really is a good environmentally friendly solution to disposing of our waste. So behavioural change, another key area, and as I said, we've just launched the 5-year communications and behavioural change strategy. The first year really looked at a whole review of what we've been doing, what other people are doing, and we've now got an 18-month action plan in place based on those findings. So 7 key aims there. So targeted campaigns to reduce contamination. We've got increase in food waste recycling, so we've just delivered a Salford food waste campaign, which was an opt-out campaign, so rather than opt-in, residents had to opt out if they didn't want that service, which proved to be really successful. Our education centres are looking at a new e-learning platform, which came out of the review, and that will be launched in the next 2 years. To promote our compost, which currently is Revive, so we can make it better accessible to residents. The development, I'm just going to hand it to you. The development of Recycle for Greater Manchester. So last year we launched a brand new website, so improving access for residents to communications, making it clearer for them. We're also working closely with RAP, and we have been doing over the past year, and we've developed a segmentation tool which allows us to really target key messages, calls to actions to our residents. It puts residents into different personas, so there's 7 different sections, and we're using that information now through all our materials and targeted campaigns to really get the key messages out there to them.
Thank you. So what does that mean performance-wise? We've put a raft of infrastructure, we're doing behavioural change. And what I'll do is we've just recently got some of the 17-18 data, so I'll be able to expand on what is performance. So 16-17, as overall recycling rate was 46.7. Now this combines both what the collection authorities are delivering to us and how our facilities are working. Unfortunately for 17-18, that figure's dropped by about 3%. Now that's due to, we unfortunately had a fire at one of our facilities, and that is off stream. So his Bolton Thermal Recovery Facility is currently offline. That affects his recycling rates. And some of the facilities which we've got are not working to the performance which we need them to do. And you'll see when we come on to the interim facilities, but we're doing things at the moment to try and get those to be more efficient. But for waste collection authorities, it's a good news story in the fact that the first time actually waste collection authorities are delivering round about 50%. So you can see the difference between what's coming in and how those facilities are. And now that's a mixture between actually we have some contamination coming through what's being collected at curbside. So a lot either loads get rejected or they're going through the facilities, but at the end of that facility process, there's a rejection rate, which can't be recycled. Now, when we say it can't be recycled, it's not going to landfill, it is going to our facility at Runcorn, which is a combined heat and power facility. So it's still better up the waste hierarchy than landfill, but clearly not. As diversion rate is 85 for this year, and as overall household waste recycling centres, about 40%. Interim facilities, we are starting to modify some of those facilities to get them more efficient. So we are looking to modify 3 of as mechanical biological treatments by taking out the biological treatment, which hasn't worked as effectively as what we'd like. And by doing this, we're going to drive down savings within the contract. We're currently having a procurement exercise to deal with that. And we're speaking to some very specialised companies at the moment in order to get that work done prior to the contracts commencing in April 19. So you'll also see this year we'll have a number of planning applications coming through your districts in order to try and do those modifications. So Reliance Street, the Newton Heath, MBT and Chichester, as well as the Rochdale Biowaste will then start to have modifications made to their planning applications. In terms of the procurement, we've gone out rather than an integrated solution. We've got a 3-lot solution which looks at breaking down the infrastructure which we've got is massive, and in order to make them more manageable for contractors, we've broke it down into 3 ways. That enables us to have very, very defined specialist contractors work on those specialist areas, and that's hopefully lot 2 and lot 1 to drive us out our waste recycling performance up to above 60%, and it's currently at 40% at the moment. So I think when it comes on to the waste strategy, there's a vast number of changes which are taking place. We've seen what's coming through, and the report's very prescriptive about what is out there. And what we need to do is move from a waste disposal strategy to taking in that wider green cities agenda as well, and start moving towards that zero waste, zero plastics, carbon neutrality, and what can we do as a waste disposal element, how can we feed into that? The plans which have come through both from the EU and through the Environment Plan are all pushing the zero waste agenda, building upon that circular economy. How can we create an environment which is sustainable, which has good solid end markets? As Greater Manchester, the biggest thing which people will say is we don't deal with plastics, we only have plastic bottles. That's because it's not economically advantageous for us to do that at the moment, plus there's not the end markets there. The market is moving constantly, and we're working to try and generate market interest to make sure that we can, when the market is right, enable us to take those products. So we're not sitting still, we are constantly looking, and the work of the strategy which we'll be doing is how do we stimulate that market, how can we get so that we can make it as easy for residents to recycle as much as possible and reduce the capacity in that residual bin even more. So what are we going to do? We're going to put as outline proposals out of what we think that strategy should be looking like in July. As part of that, because the change is so vast, we have to do a sustainable environment assessment to make sure that a strategy is moving us in the right direction. We don't want a strategy which takes us back on as environmental sustainability. And then we'll go out for public consultation once that strategy has been devised, to then get sign-off around February and March.
Thank you very much. Does any councillor have any questions or comments on this item? I've got Councillor Walker and then Councillor Robinson. Councillor Walker.
Okay, a couple of points. First of all, when you were talking about behaviour change, you're first on the list, which is probably in many ways the most controversial, is about reducing residential contamination in bins. Because it's one of those that it's quite difficult for us as politicians to deal with. This is where people deliberately, for instance, throw plastic in the green waste. But if they don't put it at the top of the waste, the problem is for us all that then becomes a contaminated load, because it goes into that vehicle and then it can get lost in there. And so we've got that dilemma. And I know locally we're trying to tackle that. and we're biting the bullet, because part of biting the bullet is to say to some of our residents that seem to not care, then there has to be sanctions, and the sanctions will include fines. You know, there doesn't. If that's the only way, we're doing all the education, we're doing the warning and everything else, but I am interested to hear if there's any new ideas as far as that's concerned. So that's the first one. The second point I want to just make, and maybe, because you didn't make it plain, but maybe it was in there, was that splitting into three. Because one of the because Wigan's a little bit different from most authorities, because we're not part of the Greater Manchester sort of scheme. We buy, and actually we as councillors are always keen to come into the Greater Manchester scheme. But when we look at the hard facts on it, you're a lot dearer. And that's part of our problem. So dearer doesn't mean, you know, cheapest doesn't mean best. We all know that. We learnt that a long time ago. But clearly, for every one of us now, because I hear that there's murmurings within other areas in Greater Manchester, if we're not very price conscious, then, you know, life becomes that there's a danger that more and more break away. And I just want to know if that's what that three-part structure is about, and what we've done so that our facilities, we want them to be clearly super environmentally friendly, but we also want them to be cost efficient. So can you just, we didn't seem to spend any time on that, and maybe that's because that's for a different presentation, but it felt that that's a very important part of our strategy.
Yeah. So first point, contamination. Contamination is a major problem, both at the front end, at the curbside, and once it is. We have a policy where actually probably not many of our loads get rejected at the front end, because we have people there trying to sort out the contamination to allow the maximum amount of product to actually get through where it needs to get to maximise the recycling. So yes, it is a problem, and there'll be a lot of Greater Manchester citywide communications taking place to try and tackle contamination. The changes which have happened within the Asian market with China, paper and card, it is a complication, and a lot of districts nationally are having to look at the way in which they collect things in order to be able to hit the markets in which they needed to do. I think it's clear to say in terms of, yes, the Greater Manchester solution through the PFI was probably not the most cost effective, and that's one of the reasons in why we've been one of the first people to come out of that PFI arrangement. The work in which we put in through on the interim arrangements are going to drive those costs down further, because the changes which we're looking to make to as MBT facilities will simplify that process. So the costs which are there, and the workforce which is required to actually man those facilities. So we'll see over the next 12 months that costs will come down, and then we are hoping that the procurement will again further drive down those costs once again. So whilst we're in procurement at the moment, I can't sit here and project what those savings will be, but there will be significant savings we are anticipating through the strategy which we have of that free lot strategy, in order to drive further cost savings to make us more competitive.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Robinson.
You said on your presentation about comparison to what and where.
Comparison, sorry,
Yes, you said you've looked at some comparisons. Is it comparison of areas or sites or best practice? And if it is best practice, where?
when we're looking at behavioural change, we look at a number of areas. So we look at best practice nationally. We have a partnership with RAP, which work with us to look at what is happening. So we're quite fortunate. So one of the key things, we have a number of flats, a high percentage of flats within Manchester and Salford. There's pilots going on in London at the moment to look at how the best way to introduce recycling and food recycling. We're very much watching at this moment in time to see. We have a partnership. I'm going down to London to speak to them to see how they're managing to get there so that we don't increase contamination, because there's huge contamination within flats when you introduce. So we look in and we explore a range of things. We pilot different things to look. In terms of waste disposal sort of functions, we have a membership with all waste disposal authorities looking at what's happening, and we benchmark across those. But there's nobody like us because we're the biggest. So you can take best practice, but actually Greater Manchester tends to be leading the way on what we're doing, and we've introduced things far quicker than a lot. So you know, we're probably one of the first as a GMO in a district to drive that residual waste capacity down. So we tend to have people knocking on the door to come and see us and find out what's happening. But if people are doing things differently, then we are making sure that we have those comparisons.
Right, thank you. On another point, and I'm not teaching the committee to suck eggs, we've all got problems with these pound shops and these cheap shops, and especially if they're selling these cheap bins and these cheap bowls and what have you, that we now have been told that will have to go in the household waste bin. But you've got them that size and you don't have a recycling centre, then where do these big plastic things go and how do they get disposed of? That's a point I think we should take up on this waste strategy, on how we try and address the issue of all these cheap plastics. It's out on the shops, you see them on the streets being sold cheap. We need to address that because that is a big issue. But also we may have to consider somewhere down the line what happens in Europe, the EU.
Sarah, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, plastics is a major issue. Both, you know, the Mayor has said we want to eradicate plastic, single-use plastics. In terms of trying to deal with the plastic situation, RAP are doing a lot of work to try and work with industry to get sort of so that we have a standardised plastic to minimise the range of plastics. It's very confusing for anybody who you see a recycling sign on a plastic tub and you automatically think that it's recyclable. We need to work on those messages to try and get both industry to make it simpler, and in such doing so that will make it easier at the back end for us to be able to look at what facilities we need to invest in.
Councillor Gunnotis.
I think there's a wider point, I think, in terms of your question. We need to align incentives across the market. So at the moment, there's an incentive to create lots of plastic and to do it cheaply and to sell it cheaply. But then that's pushing the cost onto residents and onto public authorities in terms of recycling costs. We need to align them a bit more. Hopefully, we're beginning to see the start of moves in that direction. So, as you know, China are banning now the import of plastics for recycling, so that the incentive is being put on countries like ourselves to do more in that respect. That might then feed into their own domestic market in terms of the production of plastic, because so much comes from China. There's the point that Sarah makes about having a consistency of plastic use, because the big issue isn't necessarily the amount of plastic that's created, it's how we throw it away and how disposable it is. Plastic in itself once it's produced, isn't then damaging to the environment, but it is depending on how it's disposed of. So we do have that wider plastics challenge that we're setting within GM, but I think this is a big issue for the country, and it's part of the 25-year plan and something that the EU will want to reflect on. Just coming back to the point about yoghurt pots, it's really interesting because, as you know, we don't recycle yoghurt pots in Greater Manchester, and people think that we do. It is technically possible to recycle yoghurt pots. There's no technical reason why you can't do it. The problem is there's no market for that type of low-grade plastic. So we've got this dilemma really between what's technically possible, and we could start recycling yoghurt pots across Greater Manchester, but it would cost a fortune. It would come back to your point, because there's no market for it. There's no return on investment. So as part of this, I think it goes wider than this strategy. We need to look more widely, as I say, on incentives and how the market works together, because on plastics, it doesn't in the way that, for example, it does in many other areas of waste that we create. So the point that you make is a really good one. We can only partially address it through this strategy, but what you've raised is a bigger challenge for the Combined Authority.
Okay, on my list I've got Councillors Booth, Morgan, Winstanley and Abdullah. Councillor Booth.
Thank you, Chair. You've kind of touched on sort of answering what I was going to ask. You talk about this behavioural change, and in Alex's report there's mention of the trade waste, and I think it's the co-op and the pizza packaging, etc. I'll give you an example. I shopped in Morrison's a couple of days ago. I bought half a cucumber. Not only was it wrapped in plastic around the cucumber, it was then put in another plastic sealed bag. So going on from what Councillor Walker was saying, yes, there are people that still throw plastic in the green bin, but I think the mindset of people is starting to change. But I'm wondering, what influence do you have with these retailers to actually get them to, if any at all, to adapt and use different sort of packaging, or not excessive packaging? If you go in the supermarket now, there are conversations that you didn't hear 5 years ago, and people are picking like a punnet of strawberries and saying, oh my God, how much plastic do we really need on it? So I think the profile of this issue is there, but there are still certain barriers. Forgive me, you know, if you all know the answer to this, but I'm new to this committee, and I just wondered what influence you would have, you know, with retailers.
Yeah, in fact, probably more so now than what we ever did in the past, and I've worked in waste disposal for 14 years, and it's always been an issue as how much influence do we actually have. You'll see through the end producer responsibility, which is legislation which government set. I think with the EU targets which are set out in here from the Circular Economy Directive, we're going to see a step change both in the producers of that, because the responsibility is going to sit more with those people and how that push now they're taxed on what they're producing, but it will be slow and it'll be step changes to get. And I think it's how much we can raise that actually this isn't what buyers actually want, because ultimately producers tend to try and meet the demands of this, you know, of what residents, you know, what the buyers want. And if it's coming from us, say, actually, that's not what we want anymore, that will have more weight than probably government legislation, which is driving it. I think slowly we're seeing that step change, but actually we don't want to have that, because we've got the environment which we need to protect, and what we're doing at this moment in time isn't protecting the environment. We are packaging things unnecessarily. And that step change needs to change, and it will start this momentum now, that first time through sort of government with their release of their environment strategy. London's just produced theirs, all very much which are all saying the same theme is we need to drive out this because it's damaging the earth.
Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Chair. You pretty much answered my points, but I think, as you indicated, then we as the consumer have the most influence with the suppliers, because if we turn around and say we don't want the packaging, then they'll stop providing it. And an example of that is the ugly vegetable scheme. You know, before we used to get the 8-inch long carrots and they used to be perfectly straight. Now you can actually buy them twisted and whatever, and that was consumer driven. The aspiration for zero waste is absolutely right, and again you've touched on this, but the problem we have is residents in Greater Manchester, good faith, are recycling as per on the packaging. So if it says it's recyclable, it can go in the plastic or the glass thing, and then we're saying to them, and then penalising them for doing what they did in good faith. I had a call the other day about a lady who said her waste was refused because she left the tops on the bottles. But she's been doing exactly the same thing for the last how many years, and they refused the whole stack. So it's that, and I think it's that message, that customer message is crucial, because if we don't get our residents that we all represent to come with us, then we're not going to move this on any further. And I think we're at that point now where we need to do something different, because we're all bedded in within our recycling, within our own boroughs, and everybody seems to be comfortable with it. And then all of a sudden, unannounced, we change the goalposts, and then when you start penalising people, they're doing things in good faith, then they say, well, stuff it, I'm not doing it. And this is what this person said to me the other day, well, I'm not recycling anymore. So, you know, it's that behavioural change and everything else. But I think the aspiration is absolutely where we should be, but I think we still have a long way to go.
Do you want to come back on that, Sarah, or should I take some more questions? Okay, Councillor Winstanley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's actually building on Andrew's point, actually. And in part of your presentation, you mentioned about potentially common policy and stronger powers as well. And I've heard Fred speak on this before, and he's quite draconian, Fred, when he gets going on about this. So I don't really want to hang and flog people when they've put potentially the wrong thing in the wrong bin. And I think it is about hearts and minds, and the person that has total disregard for recycling, when they come to sort of like say, right, we're going to fine you because you put the wrong thing in the wrong bin, they're going to go, right, I'm going to just chuck it out in the street. And actually, it's what I'm concerned about is the stronger powers and more draconian they are, it's actually going to be counterproductive, because if we then see bigger increases in fly tipping and litter, it's actually a bigger cost, and also the other environmental impact that has as well. So I think the strategy's right in terms of where we need to get to, but I think we need to invest more in terms of hearts and minds, and we need it to make it as easy as possible and as hassle-free as possible, because if it's easy for people, they're more likely to engage with it, and we're more likely to take them along that journey as well. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Abdullah.
Thank you, Chair. It's relating to your slide talking about performance achieved. If you can just elaborate on overall diversion rate of 88%. Just a little bit more knowledge, please. I wasn't sure what that was referring to. Thank you.
Yeah, diversion rate is everything which we don't send to landfill. So anything on the waste hierarchy from recovery and above. So it's usually going through sort of household waste things. It'll be low grade wood which isn't recyclable. It'll be your residual waste which has come in to the centres, but it collectively, contractually, that's everything. So it's the things which we can't send to the bit from the back end which isn't able to go to Runcorn. There's a proportion of that which won't go when it sort of makes up. So usually avoidable waste is around 90% is sort of the average, and you'll see that through even the 25-year strategy is it kinds to be 90%. If you can get to 90%, most of the other things that can't currently be recycled.
So, for example, if it's approximately 90%, so the remaining 10%, those are the items that are recycled or reused?
Yeah.
But above we have a figure for like 46.7%. So where does that 46%, where does that arrive from?
it goes to the combined heat and power facility. So your recycling rate are the things, sort of your plastics, your glass, your paper and card, the bio waste which goes to our IBCs. The rest of that is made up of what goes to energy recovery.
Oh, so the 40%, so if there's 10% remaining from the 90%, that 46% is from that remaining 10, is that correct? Right, okay, thank you.
Councillor Sadler.
Yes, just a couple of things. The ward where I live and the ward that I represent, when I walk round, the difference in the amount of litter and contaminated bins that are left because they are contaminated is quite astounding. So I'd be interested to know if there was any statistics to say what area is poor in recycling and which area is good. And another point, supermarkets, as people said, with their packaging, it annoys me. You know, you buy a litre of plums and you get a huge plastic non-recyclable container. What I've started doing is taking paper bags, putting the items in the bag and then giving the container back to the supermarket saying, my bin has been reduced, so I can't take all this. And I think if people started doing that and showing, you know, just how people are annoyed about the amount of waste, it might help.
Yeah, on the latter point, you'll have seen sort of on the news recently, there were a massive campaign in Bristol where they did that, and everybody left all the packaging at the supermarket and the pile of things which actually, you know, was coming out of the supermarkets. There's nothing better than consumers actually standing up and going, we don't in particularly want all that. I suppose for us is industry as such. If I take Kenco used to have the things in nice glass bottles which could be recycled, and in order to drive efficiencies through their organisation they went into a foil pack, which was great for them. However, when it comes to us, we can't recycle it, and this is, as we're saying, that circular economy. We need to make sure that we have joint up thinking, that the right financial solution for the company is also the right, you know, financial thing for us as consumers, because it doesn't always stack up, and that consumer power is always going to be the, you know, makes industry change. If it's not what we want, then the market will change accordingly. In terms of what you're saying in recycling, yes, you know, if we look, Trafford, Stockport are the current top recyclers. They have contamination as well as every other district. What we do is monitor, so we know if there's loads rejected, where those loads have come from, and then we work with the districts to see if there's any communication campaigns we can do to target those areas to make sure that see what's happening there and why that isn't, and work with residents to do that. So yeah, we do monitor exactly what's going on, and we have that data in rounds to be able to know where those problem areas are.
Councillor Gnotis.
Thanks. Just quickly, you both made very interesting points about the importance of not penalising people, and I think that's absolutely right. I think the approach that we need to take, this certainly happens in my council, and I would assume it happens in most of yours, is that when the council becomes aware of problem residents, what they should be doing is not fining them straight off, but actually sending a recycling officer around to educate them, to explain to them how to do things, what the difficulties are, and then if that person willfully ignores that, I think, you know, you're quite within your rights to penalise them. But it shouldn't. I completely agree with you. It shouldn't. What we shouldn't be saying to people is do this or we'll fine you. It should be more about education. Secondly, we do need to make recycling as easy as possible for residents. Now, I realise that the 4-bin system can be a bit confusing and can create contamination due to lack of understanding. But I mean, there are councils in the country that have between 9 and 12 recycling and other containers per household. So imagine what that's like. So it's about how we get that balance right. But all of these things are matters that we'll look into as part of this review, and this is why your feedback is going to be very useful.
Okay, 2 points from me before I move us on to our next item. One is I was wondering, Sarah, if you could give us an update on the current governance of the Waste and Resources team. I know that it was the Waste Disposal Authority. We're moving towards a Waste Committee. Could you give this committee an update on where that's up to? And then the other, or whether Councillor Ganotis is better placed to do that. And then or indeed Julie. The other point from me is that waste is a big and important item for this committee, and I know that the procurement of the 3 contracts is taking up a huge amount of time, rightly so, they're very large contracts. When would be an appropriate time for people from the Waste and Resources team to come back to this committee to report on the progress of that procurement exercise? So they're my 2 comments.
Thanks, Chair. The GMCA at its meeting in April, at the end of April, agreed to constitute a committee to look at waste matters and to bring back terms of reference for that committee at the end of June. So the papers for those will go out next week. In the meantime, they've made a request through local constituent councils to nominate a person to sit on that committee. So what they've agreed is a committee to deal with the matters, a reduced membership from the former Waste Authority, and then that will be formally constituted at the end of June.
And the timing to come back for an update on procurement?
Yes, so currently we are getting tender documentation ready to go out by end of next week. Those draft submissions are due back to us July time, so that should help formalise exactly what those A savings are going to look like and B what those solutions are going to look like, to then go into a second phase of competitive dialogue prior to the final tenders coming back to us in the end of October. So probably round August, September time we'll have a view of maybe what that's looking like. However, I also am aware that overview and scrutiny tends to be in open, so a lot of what is coming through there is highly confidential. So I take a view from both Julie and Susan how that would be dealt with, but if not, then round about December time is when we will know where we're at, and we'll be ready to award the contracts around that stage.
That's useful, thank you, because our work programme is on our agenda for later on, so that's useful input. Thank you very much. I'm going to move us on, Councillor Walker, because we have some timings, we have some other guests joining us, one of whom is City Mayor Paul Dennett, who is the Portfolio Lead for Planning, Housing and Homelessness. He's bringing an entourage. So we'll let them sit down because we're going to move on to item 11. Okay, welcome. We have a maximum of about half an hour for this item, which is an important item for all members in the room from all of the constituent councils. This is item 11 that we're on to, which is the Greater Manchester Housing Package. We've had some papers which we've all read in detail in advance. So welcome to Steve Rumblow and to Paul Dennett. Please go ahead and introduce the item.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me to the Scrutiny meeting today. This is to talk about the housing package we've agreed with government recently, and as probably members will know in the room, government also produced a housing white paper called Fixing the Broken Housing Market, and I'm delighted to see that government is starting to recognise in many respects some of the challenges we face, certainly within urban environments like Greater Manchester. So you'll be familiar probably with the paper if you've already read it, and what we've managed to land, if you like, within Greater Manchester is 4 bids have been successful for forward funding, and that means approximately between 230 and 240 million pounds is going to be coming into Greater Manchester to deal with issues of infrastructure and also deal with brownfield land. We've also been successful in landing a land fund of up to 50 million pounds to enable us to deliver 4,200 homes. And we've also managed to land some revenue funding. So what we've been talking about so far is capital, but we've also managed to acquire £8 million from government in revenue funding to start building a place-based team here within the combined authority to enable, if you like, Greater Manchester as a system across the 10 local authorities to work together to delivering what we've actually committed ourselves to in the housing deal. The reason why revenue funding is important is, I'm sure many of my colleagues in the room will be acutely aware of what's been going on in local government recently. Certainly from my own perspective in Salford, we've lost £198 million since 2010, and that's had a massive impact on the regeneration, economic development function of the local authority as we continue to prioritise services such as adult social care and children's services. So this is a welcome announcement from a revenue point of view as far as I'm concerned, because it then puts back that capacity to enable us to work across districts and with each other to realise some of the ambitions within the housing deal. Government have also left the door open in terms of further joint working. I think what government are probably interested in seeing off the back of the housing deal they've signed with Greater Manchester is whether or not we can actually deliver. As you know, government have committed themselves to building 300,000 homes per annum, and that seems to be very much the driving force behind some of these deals they've entered into with city regions. One of the things that's not mentioned there in terms of the summary of the outline package from A to D is we've also landed around £64 million in marginal viability funding. Marginal viability, again, is to tackle issues of brownfield, land assembly and also associated infrastructure. You'll also see at 2.2 in the report as well that there's been a long-standing issue within Greater Manchester around Collyhurst. I understand early conversations with the City Council were exploring the possibility of a private finance initiative, but what's actually happened now is we've managed to acquire 10.25 million for Collyhurst as part of the housing deal for Greater Manchester. And I'm informed as well as part of that we will be seeing affordable housing being brought forward in Collyhurst, which I understand also includes social rent. So that's certainly a welcomed announcement from my point of view, because one of the challenges I think we face at the moment in terms of housing delivery is building truly affordable housing linked to people's income rather than a housing market which seems to just grow exponentially year on year. In terms of what we've committed ourselves to as a combined authority off the back of the housing deal, you'll see there at 2.3, we've committed ourselves to building 227,200 homes between 2015-16 and 2034-35. And obviously we hope that the GMSF, the spatial framework, will be adopted by 2020 to certainly give us clarity of the land availability to actually deliver on that housing target. You'll also be aware we've already published all of the land availability outside of the Green Belt. That is now available through the Combined Authorities website, and developers and local authorities and elected members can actually see all of land availability outside of the Green Belt as it stands currently within Greater Manchester. That is already available. At B, you'll see we've committed ourselves also to an accelerated delivery to 2026 to build 12,375 homes per annum. And obviously, it's really important that the GMSF is integrated with what happens in the districts around core strategies or local plans to realise the delivery of that ambitious target for Greater Manchester. I'll just draw your attention over the page at 3.3, because I think it's important to just talk about how we envisage this working in practice within Greater Manchester, so the operational reality of how this housing package or housing deal will be carried forward. At 3.3, you can see there in terms of the prioritisation of the £50 million, the land fund, as we often refer to it as, brownfield sites, town centre development or regeneration, and affordable housing will certainly be part of how we prioritise that spend. Unlocking sites as well that require public sector intervention is going to be critical. I've already highlighted the absolute importance of delivery, because what government will be watching here is that we actually meet these targets, and obviously that will also inform any future conversations we have with government around additional capital and revenue to support the system here in Greater Manchester. And as you can see there, You know, we're committed to delivering 4,200 homes on the land fund, and it's really important that those represent value for money. Now, I draw people's attention to value for money because there are some ongoing conversations with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government at this point in time, and certainly with the Treasury around benefit cost ratio, because as part of this deal we're signed up to a benefit cost ratio of 1.5 per scheme. Now, these are challenging, to say the least, on certainly some of our schemes within Greater Manchester. So what we're doing at the moment is having conversations with government around whether the BCR can apply to the whole of the land fund, the whole of the 50 million, and therefore the whole of the schemes that sit within that. So that is an ongoing conversation. I just want to flag that as an issue that we're currently trying to work through with civil servants and ministers at the moment. In terms of the 8 million, you'll see there, one of the things we want to do is build this GM Place team, working alongside districts and ultimately working alongside the priorities, both within the land fund, the marginal viability, and also the forward fund allocations. I've already highlighted the scarcity of resource that already exists within the system around delivering housing and delivering on our ambitious targets. So obviously working across the districts and in collaboration with what already sits within the districts as a resource is going to be absolutely critical in terms of delivering on this housing package. In terms of priority projects for the team to work on, I just want to highlight what I've already in a sense said in some respects. So we've talked about priorities being very much driven by the 50 million that sits in the land fund, the forward fund allocations, the 240 million pounds, the marginal viability allocations. It's really, really important that we use the resource we've got in revenue terms to deliver on those allocations, because government will want us to get that money out the door and actually start building the houses we've committed ourselves to. Also, I just want to draw your attention that some of the housing investment fund bids were not successful across some of the districts. So government have said that, and Homes England have said that they're happy to work with us on exploring how we can potentially access further capital in the future across those unsuccessful bids. But I suspect what government will want to see is that we've got the capacity to deliver in the first instance before they release further capital or revenue on those unsuccessful housing investment fund projects. As you know, Andy Burnham's got his own town centre challenge, which is rolling out across the districts across Greater Manchester at the moment. So we envisage that some of this funding, both capital and revenue, will be to realise some of those ambitions across the city region. On top of that, you'll be aware that land availability doesn't just sit with local authorities, it sits across the public sector. We've had a One Public Estate programme which has been working for some time now within Greater Manchester, and obviously making sure that all of this work is coordinated with that activity is going to be absolutely critical. In terms of how we prioritise the allocation of spend, I think what we'll be looking for across the districts is a willingness on the part of the local authorities to engage in match funding around some of the resource allocations, because at the end of the day it's an ambitious target, and there's no way with this level of resource we'll be able to deliver everything without working closely with local authorities. I've already highlighted the absolute importance of demonstrating our ability to deliver, and I think that'll be an ongoing challenge working with the industry around this, both public and private. And then also maximising the benefits of these schemes from also other government sources of funding. So Homes England, you'll be aware, have a whole tranche of different initiatives. So using this resource really is going to be critical in trying to download additional cash through various programmes that Homes England and the Ministry of Housing sometimes run. And then I've already highlighted that we've committed ourselves to an accelerated delivery up until 2026, building 12,375 homes per annum. So absolutely prioritising that and reporting back to government is going to be critical there. Then at 3.7, I just want to draw your attention. We have historically had a land commission in Greater Manchester, but it's not really met, as far as I understand, certainly since I've held this portfolio. And one of the things what we want to do is revise that and establish a land and infrastructure commission. We envisage it probably meeting biannually, so twice a year. The rationale behind that is to have those more strategic conversations with government, one on where we're up to in terms of delivering the housing package and where we're up to with delivery, but also having those bigger conversations around the importance of truly meeting need within Greater Manchester around housing, and also infrastructure, because one thing we know, certainly from the 27,000 responses we received to the first phase of the GMSF, is the absolute importance of infrastructure in terms of delivering housing and our ambitions within Greater Manchester. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions. I mean, if there's anything I've missed, I'm sure Steve Rumbelow or Steve Fife can contribute as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I've noted Councillor Booth, and if other councillors who have a question or a comment, please indicate. Councillor Booth.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you for the report. I'm pleased to see that you've placed a lot of importance on sort of housing for all and affordable housing. But there's an area within this report that I can't see, covered, and that is we need to have housing that is inclusive for everybody. We've got an ageing population. We're changing the way we deliver health, so adult social care encompasses housing now. The aim is to keep the elderly living independently, and also, people with disabilities find it increasingly difficult to get housing that suits their requirements. There is an absolutely substantial lack of bungalows. I managed to persuade them to build 2 bungalows on a new development in my own ward of 27 houses. I was absolutely irate when I saw that they were 1-bedroomed bungalows. I'll give you an example. I just worked very hard to get a single father with a disability rehoused. And the assumption is he would need this 1-bedroom property. Well, no, he had a child. He needed 2 bedrooms. We make this assumption that it's a 1-bedroom flat, or if we're really lucky, it's a 1-bedroom bungalow. We are sitting on a ticking time bomb as the ageing population increases, and there isn't the housing that suits their requirements. I'm just wondering, has there been a piece of work done on that? How much credence has been placed upon this particular cohort of people and their housing needs?
Really good question, and I certainly welcome that question. In terms of the interface, if you like, between housing, planning and my portfolio on homelessness and rough sleeping, and also the health and social care partnership, it is very much an issue that we're currently exploring with the health and social care partnership, because the relationship between health and housing is a really, really important one. What I would say, though, is before I come to the specific on bungalows, is we did have a bit of an issue, and the issue was more around welfare reform. So government were dragging their feet on the local housing allowance for some time, and what that was doing was it was snarling up things like sheltered accommodation and extra care schemes within Greater Manchester. Government have recently given way on that, which is good news as far as I'm concerned. So we are currently in the process of evaluating extra care schemes within Greater Manchester, working with our health and social care partnership with a view to rolling out more of that. Certainly in my local authority in Salford, I've visited some of the extra care schemes, and it's fantastic what's going on there and how they're creating a community, they're addressing issues of social isolation, whilst also allowing people to live independently, which is a really, really important point, and I'm glad that you drew attention to that. On the issue of bungalows and housing need, if you like, within districts, that is very much a matter for your local plans and for your core strategies. So I'd be encouraging all members, if you think there's a paucity of supply in terms of bungalows, then the vehicle to try and change that is through your local plans. The GMSF is not going to be the mechanism to do that. We do want a housing strategy for Greater Manchester, and we do want to demonstrate that we're working towards genuinely meeting need within Greater Manchester, but that will require the districts to participate with the combined authority and with the GMSF around this agenda, because actually the sovereignty for housing needs sits with the districts. It doesn't currently sit with the combined authority and our constitutional arrangements. But there is a willingness amongst leaders I'm aware of for us to genuinely do something quite good, really, I would argue, on the issue of housing need within Greater Manchester, which is great. Thanks.
Councillor Walker.
Yes, I'm very conscious of the fact that the North West tends to lag behind in any housing development, that any booms that come along, but we're very quick to react when it slows down. So one of the things that I'm recognising regularly, and I just wonder whether you've looked at it in this strategy, is whether, because developers have to be careful, I suppose is one way of putting it. Once they're committed to a scheme and they've started the scheme, they're likely to keep it running, because they've spent the starting point of any scheme is always the dear bit. You know, there's loads of infrastructure and all those things cost a lot of money before you sell the first house. And I just wonder if there's, when we're reflecting on actually achieving, because you keep on making the point, it's an absolutely valid one. If we haven't got a track record of delivering what we say, then government doesn't, I don't blame them, it doesn't give you any more money. But I just wonder whether what there is extra that we can do to make sure that we keep it going as long as we can, but that we react quickly when the market's coming up, because sometimes looking into something which might take us 6 or 9 months, it's just delaying, you know, seizing that opportunity when housing markets are up anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a welcome question, Councillor Walker. And I think government acknowledge that, you know, we do have those kind of boom and bust cycles within the housing market nationally. And one of the reasons why we have the Housing Investment Fund, the £300 million within Greater Manchester, was in direct response, if you like, to what happened in 2007, 2008, when we saw the financial crash, which did then play out within the construction industry and housing delivery nationally. So, you know, government acutely aware of wanting to work with us. What I would say, though, is we've never really been in, certainly not in my lifetime, in terms of my involvement in local government, we've never been in a position where government have given us so much money and wanting to actively work with us. You know, we've received hundreds of millions of pounds now through the marginal viability, through the forward fund, through the land fund, and even a revenue source of £8 million to enable us here within Greater Manchester to deliver. So government know that, you know, there's a real desire to build, and that, you know, we've been demonstrating that over recent years, and they've now given us even more money to do even more. So I think this relationship with government is probably going to be a long-standing one around delivering housing within Greater Manchester, which is welcome news. And, you know, that additional cash allows us to prioritise brownfield land, which has often been a bit of a sticking block with developers not wanting to necessarily pick up the cost of land remediation, the associated infrastructure costs, land assembly, and dealing with other issues as well with those lands. So, you know, we are moving in the right direction, and this is the start of that process, I think.
I suppose part of the point I'm making, because you have got some money here for, if I can call it backroom work, is to have it sat on the shelf. You know, not something we have to... it's difficult because the world keeps on changing, I recognise that. But having stuff ready to go, it can take a year or 18 months off a lead-in time. And doing that is a really important part of what the public sector can do. And I'm just trying to emphasise that simple point, because, to be honest, it's only when the market's really booming, even though when we've got a bit of additional marginal money on the difficult sites that where there's a very marginal cost in making a profit, no one really wants them when, you know, when the market's down, because they're going to be difficult come what may. You know, you mentioned Collyhurst, but, you know, Collyhurst, for instance, isn't somewhere that everybody wants to live unless the market's doing really well and we sell it as part of, you know, just outside Manchester city centre. But you know, there's other areas where we know it will happen. So that stuff about the brownfield, the difficult brownfield sites, I really think that it's those are very hard to manage outside a boom time.
I think the point you make about having stuff that's ready to go is a really, really important point. And certainly, you know, what I've learned, certainly in Salford over the last couple of years, is that, you know, doing that master planning, you know, up front, so you've got that vision, you know what it is you want to deliver as a local authority, is absolutely critical to get buy-in from developers and also ultimately attract investment to make these sorts of things happen. And I think, you know, now we've got this 8 million to build this GEM place-based team, that offers us a real opportunity to coordinate this activity across the city region and across the 10 local authorities to do exactly what you're talking about, you know, get stuff ready to go. So it's just about lifting it off the shelf and making it happen in a sense. But, you know, we mustn't forget, you know, by the end of this financial year, our budgets, certainly in Salford, will have been cut by over 50%. That's taken out significant levels of resources. And, you know, we've made the case back to government on this, that we desperately need that revenue resource to do exactly what you're talking about. Thankfully, with the housing deal, it looks like government are starting to listen to us. But they did take the money off us in the first instance, and we mustn't forget that.
Steve, and then I'm going to bring in Councillor Winstanley.
Yeah, just to emphasise that point, I think you've identified the real sort of issue for us is we've got, Paul's identified 350, 60 million pounds to help to unlock difficult sites, and we've got to spend that and spend that well, because if we don't, we won't get further funding. So that's why our priority for this team is to make sure that gets delivered first. We will try to apply some of that capacity to preparing, if you like, for the next round of potential bids. But it is a dilemma. I think there's also got to be a responsibility on districts to do some of that forward thinking. But underpinning all that, of course, is the one thing we have got is GMSF is fundamentally a 20-year plan which will help us to determine where we should be putting our focus in terms of public sector interventions to make things happen.
Councillor Winstanley.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks very much for the report and your explanation behind it as well. As you've already highlighted, there's quite substantial amount of funding going into this, and you've said several times as well, governments are expecting to deliver. We've obviously touched upon a couple of those points in terms of where potential problems could be, not least the housing market and things like that. In terms of how confident are you that you're going to be able to deliver on what you've set out? Where do you envisage the problems, apart from potentially the housing market, which is obviously outside your control? But in terms of where those other potential problems are, and what plans have we got to try and ensure that those can be smoothed out as quickly as possible? Because I actually think that this whole scheme and what we're doing here is basically going to make or break devolution. Because if we can demonstrate that, because for years and years and years, we said we want the power, they've given us the power. Then they said, we can't do that, but without the money. They started, admitted that budgets have been taken at local government level, but we are now getting some finance here with this. So if we are actually going to make devolution a success, and this model that we've got in Greater Manchester, I think this is the key part of actually making that a success across Greater Manchester, and then potentially around the country, if this is going to be the model that works. So really it's thinking about what are those problems, and how have we got a plan already to start to envisage what those problems are, so we're not hitting buffers down the line and then saying, oh, well, we've got to go back to square one, and how are we going to get around it?
And what we have done is, and it's not referred to in the paper, but we've got the £8 million, and obviously it's going to take us some time to gear up and start and put the people in place to deliver that support to districts. And I think it's important to emphasise that is designed to be support to districts. It's not sort of something that's been done to districts. What we're doing in the meantime is we're working with some consultants. So districts are already getting support from some consultants so that we can hit the ground running, really, and we're not wasting time. But fundamentally, most of this money, apart from the £50 million, most of the money are bids that have been put together by districts. So we're reliant on working with districts to help them with the capacity to get things delivered. But there should be a good level of knowledge within districts already around that. The 50 million is slightly different in that was supposed to be flexible funding, and Paul mentioned the benefit cost ratio problem we had. The reason a number of bids failed in Greater Manchester, particularly in places like my own district in Rochdale, Wigan, Bolton, particularly the northern areas where land values are not quite as good, is that we couldn't make them stack up based on that 1.5 benefit cost ratio. And at the moment, the issue we've got with the CLG and the Treasury is they're wanting to apply that same methodology to the £50 million, which was supposed to be more flexible to allow us to do things that wouldn't otherwise get done. And so it's really important we win that argument, I think.
For me as well, another one of the issues or concerns is if you've read this in detail, you'll realise there's very little in here about truly affordable housing or social housing. And that is a bit of a sticking block at the moment with government. I mean, Homes England currently don't release grant to enable councils and housing associations to actually build for social rent. A lot of their schemes are geared towards what they refer to as affordable home ownership, or rent to buy, or shared ownership. And there's a real issue here for me, because when you look at the history of Greater Manchester and the number of homes we've lost under right to buy, and how quite often, certainly in recent years, those homes have not been replaced despite a capital receipt being realised, we've got a big challenge here. So if we're genuinely committed to building homes that meet need, we need to desperately see some more truly affordable housing coming forward. And the housing deal at the moment that we've struck with government doesn't directly respond to that. What it does do is it says that the door's still open around further conversations with government and Homes England about some of these sorts of issues. But needless to say, that isn't stopping us, certainly me in my portfolio, working with the officers of the CA, making the case back to government. And we will be taking a paper to the Planning and Housing Commission soon, actually, hopefully, which illustrates what's been happening historically with social housing, council housing and right to buy, with a view to then obviously writing to the Secretary of State or the Housing Minister to say, look, you really need to start working with us on this agenda, because building truly affordable housing, I think, is one of the big obstacles at the moment. You all know in this room that developers time and time again turn round to us at a local authority level saying that schemes are non-viable, therefore they, curb their contributions to Section 106, or they curb their contributions to affordable housing. And I accept that, land values and property prices in places like Greater Manchester are different to the south of the country, and certainly the City of London and the southeast, which will have an impact on viability, and I totally accept that. But that shouldn't stop us from working with government to build the homes that we truly need for the people of Greater Manchester. So I do see that as an ongoing challenge moving forward. And delivery in and of itself is one thing, but delivering the houses that people genuinely need is another thing. And that, for me, is where we should be as a system here in Greater Manchester.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Paul and Steve. Previous meeting we were at was to deal with not just the housing, but the funding that the government had held back for a long time. And where I'm coming from is the homeless side of things, because to build these properties, I would like to know how that will have a benefit for people that are homeless for various reasons, because you've got people like Serco have given the North a bad name because they decided they're going to use their houses up here because they're cheaper than anywhere else. To me, that gave us a bad name in the first place. So how we deal with people like that, but also from a personal experience of trying to help people. We asked one developer that to make sure that some of the homes that they built were for ordinary people that wanted to rent. Then when they built the property, we found they put the expensive to buy properties at the front in a nice area, and they stuck the low rent homes to rent for smaller families or one-parent families at the back of the properties, right next to a railway station and a rail track. Now, to me, that is treating people as second-class citizens, because it should be mixed, front and back. Both should have both types of properties, and the quality of the houses at the back weren't the same as the quality of the houses at the front. So that also needs to be looked at, but I think the 10 districts need to look at that more closely within their own districts. And I'm glad you're working with Andy on the homelessness stuff, because he's already got my views on that.
Okay, just in responding to some of that, certainly. I think the first comment you made was about the government prior to the Conservative Party conference talking about releasing £2 billion nationally to allow councils and housing associations to build. I have to say we've got no real further clarity on that, despite the announcement being made prior to the Conservative or during the Conservative Party conference. So I can't give you any update on that other than to say I have been exchanging letters with the Secretary of State, who's now changed. It was previously Sajid Javid, but now that's changed. So we probably really need to send those letters again, probably to the new Secretary of State to ask where things are up to. It was told to me the other week that we were expecting government to make an announcement on this sort of stuff. We were hoping that would have been last week. That didn't materialise. So unfortunately, we're no further forward with understanding how this £2 billion that's talked about nationally is going to be allocated to allow councils and housing associations to build. In terms of, providing homes that, you can't differentiate from being private home ownership to, rent for ordinary people, I think is what you said. I absolutely agree with you. And, we shouldn't differentiate on quality. And actually, if we genuinely believed in mixed housing communities, then we would have been realising this a long time ago, because it's not new news, is it, where we talked about these sorts of issues. What I would say, though, is those sorts of issues for me are to be dealt with probably through your local plan, but also to be dealt with through the planning committee, which, as you probably know, is a non-executive function of the local authority. So, if plans are coming forward where houses are clearly of a different standard or a different quality and are located not in the greatest of places within a development site, then those sorts of issues I would encourage you to raise and air, certainly within the planning committee, to hopefully get the developer and officers in the council to relook at some of those issues. But I'm really sympathetic to what you're saying. If we genuinely believed in mixed housing communities, then we wouldn't make these differentiations on quality and location of housing within developments. I absolutely support that. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, Steve?
I think you were referring to the asylum contract as well, so it's probably worth just a quick mention of that. I mean, Greater Manchester set out to do right by asylum seekers and wanted to make sure that it was doing all it could to support. And I think fundamentally the government's abused that position, because the northwest, Greater Manchester and certain parts of Greater Manchester, in particular, again, the lower value areas, have taken far more than their fair share of asylum seekers. We, again, have tried to work with government positively on that, but I think we've got to the stage now when we're having to push back quite hard, because although they say all the right things, action never follows that actually changes the outcome. So I think we are in a different place with that, where we are having a more difficult discussion with government.
Can I just say on that as well? I mean, I am aware of this issue. It's been a long-standing issue, and I agree with a lot of what Steve's just said. And the immigration minister in this country does actually have the power to mandate the widening of dispersal. And what I mean by that is to basically require every single local authority in the country to receive asylum seekers and refugees. And for whatever reason, the government have chosen not to use those powers, and the immigration minister has chosen not to mandate the widening of dispersal, but they've chosen to work on an ad hoc basis in sort of partnership arrangements with willing local authorities or city regions like Greater Manchester. So just to let you know that the government have the power to do something about this. It's about whether or not they exercise that power and choose to do so.
Okay, my questions are about timing. So working backwards from when people are going to get keys to properties that have been built through some of these schemes. GMSF version 2 is a little bit delayed. It's coming to the CA in, I think, July rather than June. How are the 10 boroughs looking in terms of their local plans? And when do you think people will get keys for properties built through these schemes?
Yeah.
Well, we're under enormous pressure to deliver these properties quickly, and so the funding that's available, once we can actually get the rules agreed in a way that work for us, we need to move very quickly on that. And there are already a number of each district is already looking at sites where that could be applied. But broadly speaking, we need to show significant delivery within 3 years.
What can I just say, certainly from Salford's perspective, we're we're significantly helping with numbers at the moment because we're over-delivering on our objectively assessed housing need in some respects. I mean, I think we're in the top 5 nationally for building homes at the moment. There's some work done recently, and obviously that's been produced. And so we are playing our part within Greater Manchester to help all the districts. And, you know, it's been said before, the town centre challenge and urban density is one of the ways we're going to mitigate ultimately the impact on Greenbelt through the GMSF. So it's about doing more of that within the city region and exploiting, if you like, some of those brownfield first sites to really deliver some of these numbers and to support the districts across the piece. That's why that strategic approach in all of this is going to be really, really important. It is about the local plans, but it's also about how the districts talk to each other and how we work with each other to help us all realise the vision for Greater Manchester in terms of building the homes that people need, but also in the right places.
So you're acting as a warm-up act to the Mayor, who's the next item on the agenda to talk about the Town Centre Challenge. Before you go, rough sleeping is in your portfolio, I think I'm right in saying. This committee had a really useful meeting in the last municipal year about rough sleeping. We had some external speakers come in and talk to us. And when we come on to our work programme discussion, I'm keen that we have that as an item on later meeting agendas. I wondered if there are things in your portfolio that you're particularly keen to involve this committee with, because we're planning our year, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say we're going to be doing this in September. We'd love to come and talk to you about it.
So I guess the 2 things in my portfolio which are priority are the housing strategy for Greater Manchester and obviously the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, and then, if you like, enacting the strategies we've already worked on and agreed around the 10-year homelessness strategy and hopefully ending rough sleeping by 2020. So those are kind of the main areas of activity, so more than happy for you to work with us on that. And I think we've made the offer as well to the Scrutiny Committee to work with us strategically through things like their Planning and Housing Commission and be involved really in the work programme of my portfolio. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. A number of members are new on this committee, so we could perhaps circulate some information about the Planning and Housing Commission, because it's an open invitation to members of this committee if they'd like to go along to those meetings, if they'd like to be involved with the work of that commission. Thank you very much. Okay, I propose that we do indeed note and welcome the announcement, and I think we've completed that item. Item number 12 is update work on Town Centre Challenge. Welcome to Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester. We've got the report that's talked about all the progress that's been made on this. Why don't you introduce this item?
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. So there is a good deal of progress to report on, but maybe just to pick up on what Paul Dennett was saying as I came in. And obviously this is in some ways a standalone initiative you could look at, but it's part of a broader attempt to refocus our approach to housing and planning. And I would say adopt let's say a less developer-led approach, whereby, as we've seen in the last 20 years, it's no fault of any individual council, but as councils have lost capacity, we've been in a position where developers have had more ability to dictate what they will do and where they will go and what they will do in terms of affordability. And what we're trying to do is kind of move things into a new position where we are clearer about the places that we want to see regenerated, building more homes closer to public transport infrastructure, and actually addressing a kind of wider issue that I think is true across the country, which is the future of towns outside of city centres. It's a very live political issue. Lisa Nandy, MP for Wigan, is very much taking this forward as a political campaign, and I think she's right to do so. If you look back in recent times, I think, you know, with good intentions, people have tried to do something on town centres, but these initiatives have foundered because they haven't stacked up, I think, commercially. So the most recent venture into this space was the Portus review of around about 6-7 years ago, Mary Portus, and it was very much focused around kind of the town as the retail centre, and how do you kind of then reinvent it as a retail centre? And I think that's probably where it went wrong, because as we know, the patterns in retail have changed fundamentally against some of the towns, the outlying towns of Greater Manchester, out of town shopping, but also online shopping. And you know, it feels to me that if you're trying to adopt a retail-led approach to town centre regeneration, you're probably going to struggle and never actually achieve what you're trying to do. So this in some ways, it's controversial in its own way, in the way that sort of issues around greenbelt and planning are controversial. To say to people, you know, the town is not going to be the retail and an employment destination that it once was. Therefore, it is time to think of it more as a high-quality residential destination. You know, that isn't an uncontroversial message, but it's the right one in my view, because if you bring high-quality, high-density residential back to some of our outlying towns, you then possibly create a new retail or leisure offer, which is more bars, restaurants, coffee shops, and possibly cultural, cinemas, that kind of offer. So this is what we're trying to do with the town centre challenge. And as Paul was explaining, the agreement of a housing deal with the government actually adds some significant power to our elbow here, Chair, in terms of the land fund that we've got. So all of a sudden there are sites that may not have been viable going back a year or two ago that suddenly might be viable. The other thing is obviously the spatial framework and what might be said in that. And, you know, whether people wanted a mayor or not, the point of a mayor is there are powers now to set up mayoral development corporations. There are powers of intervention around CPO. So, you know, people may as well use them. You've got a mayor now, and you may as well take some of the benefits of that, which is around a more interventionist approach to housing and planning. So all of a sudden, we've got some tools in our locker here that we didn't have. And hence the Town Centre Challenge, hopefully, so far probably is more the kind of initial talking and the, you know, lots of talking shops and would be prepared to admit that. But the question is now, can it move now to a more delivery phase that will build some confidence in the whole idea? So the paper sets out the summary of events so far in terms of the meetings held. A couple of things just to, I think, as part of an update on the paper, Oldham Council, following the local elections, has nominated Royton, which I've accepted as a nomination, alongside some of the work that they want to do in Oldham. But we are accepting Royton as a specific nomination now under the Town Centre Challenge. Everywhere else, the initial meeting has been done apart from Trafford, but I think there are arrangements in place to do the event in Stretford next month. So we've done that initially, largely. We've barring the Oldham and Trafford situation, we've done that initial sort of gingering up of the discussion. What I would say from here on in is it's very much in the hands of districts to decide how fast they want to drive this and what they want to draw down in terms of the support that I can provide. The two probably three probably I would say most advanced are Prestwich, Stockport and Stalybridge. So we have been in discussions with Berry and Councillor Shorey around Prestwich, where there was a kind of a scheme under consideration some time ago around the name of the cultural centre, which I can't remember. Longfield Centre. And at the back there, in terms of the car park linking to the Metrolink stop. I think those proposals have moved forward since the initial Town Centre Challenge event, and then there's now a second event planned for August, and I think the hope is that they may move forward again at that point. So Prestwich seems to be moving. Stalybridge actually attracted some of the best interest of any of the events. I think there's a clear feeling in Stalybridge that the ingredients are there for success, with the location on the Transpennine line already. New charter, one of the local housing associations has developed schemes in the town centre which have sold very well. I think there's a lot of excitement in Stalybridge about it. It kind of seems to kind of come at the right time for the council, for Tameside as well. So Stalybridge has a second event that is going to take place on the 9th of July, and there are some schemes that are beginning to move forward there as not necessarily as a result of our meeting, but kind of are moving down the track. On Stockport, there is a couple of things to say there. One is that the proposal that has been developed by Stockport Council and TFGM for the redevelopment of Stockport Interchange as a transport and housing scheme is very impressive, and I think is something of an exemplar, really, if we can make it work, in that, you know, we should be thinking about redeveloping transport hubs with housing built in. But as far as I know of the Stockport plans, there is good green space and civic amenity built into that scheme as well. And I think, you know, it's going to come soon to the, I think it's possibly coming to the June combined authority. Julie's nodding. So that's coming forward quite quickly now. And I think if we can sign that off at the GMCA, I think that will give the Town Centre Challenge a real kind of boost, actually, Chair, because it's a scheme that almost embodies everything that we hope for the Town Centre Challenge. The second development linked to Stockport is the question of whether or not it might become the first town to ask for powers for a mayoral development corporation. I think the nature of, you know it much better than I do, but the nature of the land, I think, to the west of the Arches, where I think there's a kind of a sense that there is housing potential there, and, you know, it's currently a mix of industrial uses, that could be an area that we might look at. Now, it's obviously, as I say, for the council to tell us and me whether or not that's something that is intended to be pursued. But if you start thinking of some of these 10 towns becoming mayoral development corporations, you might argue, well, what is the precise benefit of that? And I'm sure Simon could explain to you some of what that might bring. But it's actually I mean, a lot of this is about confidence, isn't it? A lot of this is about saying, we, the council, and we, GMCA, back this town. We see potential in this town. We are giving it this status, you know, and that moves the market around it. And I think, if we're honest, it's happening probably more in Stockport. I'm not just saying this for your benefit, Chair, but it's probably true because of the work that the council's done to promote the idea of town centre living. I mean, let's remember, if you go back 20 years ago, that was a new idea with regard to the city centre. You know, it wasn't how people thought of living as they were, you know, going into their 30s and thinking about their first home. But now it is. It's a big change. And almost we're trying to prove the same concept for our towns now. You know, people have thought of buying homes in the outskirts, in an estate, not necessarily in the town centre. So we are trying to promote a new concept, if you like. Stockport is very much marketing that idea. And it will take some work, and it will take some sticking at. But my early kind of foray into the Town Centre Challenge tells me that there is huge appetite. It's the right initiative at the right time. It will help us rebalance the GMSF if we can make some of these schemes come forward and we can show that there is real delivery here. I do intend to say to districts, there's a round 2, there's a round 3, there's a round 4. You know, I don't want to exclude, you know, because I have faced some pressure from Wigan. You know, there was objections to Lee. It was why not Atherton and Ashton and other places, and which is fair enough. You know, there's always a sense that there's a chosen town and then the others are forgotten. And, you know, in Bury it's Radcliffe feels very much like that. Maybe Middleton in Rochdale. So I don't want that to be the case. You know, I want us to sort of prove a concept here and then work through those kind of second and third and possibly fourth, fifth waves of Town Centre Challenge. But that's some way down the line. This is obviously, you know, a first report in terms of early early experience, and I hope that's of interest to the committee.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you'd be welcome back when more has been achieved than some jolly meetings. Councillor Winstanley, I'm going to bring you in.
Thank you. And thanks, Andy, for the report. And I think what you've described, I think you're right. There is an appetite for this, because we can all look round our various town centres in our 10 districts, and it's a crying shame in terms of what's happened to them and when we see how vibrant they were. But unfortunately, as you rightly identified, some of those retail opportunities are now gone because of the way people live their lives and everything else. So it's good to hear that this isn't the sort of like the only sort of like round of this, that we are going to look at this, and I can see potential for this in many other parts of the Wigan borough, as you obviously know Wigan sort of like quite well. Obviously the report is pretty light on timescales and things like that, and you've obviously identified that districts are sort of like leading this. In terms of putting a bit more meat on the bone then, in terms of some of the timescales and delivery plans around this, is this something that's going to be sort of like built up over the next few months as we move forward? And what are the plans if things are sort of like slipping? Because obviously, don't necessarily wish to help you out politically, but obviously if this is your, the mayoral plan, and things aren't going to plan, and people are saying, well, it's another Andy Burnham promise, and he's not delivered, and all that kind of stuff. I'm just thinking about a couple of years' time when we get obviously. So what plans have you got to make sure that districts are actually feeding into this in a timely way?
I mean, it's a very good question, and no, I'm very, just a broader point, kind of joking aside, I'm conscious in this role, that there's go back a year, people were saying, oh, we don't need a mayor, be a white elephant, we don't, just another, we don't get that anymore. What we get is, why haven't you sorted this? Why haven't you done that? So the debate has already changed, I think, and people can see that maybe there's a role for mayors in different places, but the open question now is, can they deliver? Yeah, and I'd be the first to say I accept that, and I hear that, and I think the pressure is very much on us in this building now to, we are a newish administration, and it's still early days in some ways, but the way the world is these days, people aren't necessarily going to wait forever, are they, to see signs of change on the ground? So I accept that challenge completely. With this one, there's a kind of added thing in that it's not all in our gift either. This is there's complex, isn't it? You can't force the private sector to go and develop in Lee, much as I'd love to do that. You're kind of coaxing them, aren't you? In some ways, you can't force them. And the truth is, if you look at the list of 10 that have come through, in terms of viability and closeness to sort of the market, some are much closer to the front than others. So I picked out 3. I think those are the 3. Stretford possibly as well. I mean, obviously we've not done the work there. Rochdale's got some interest. I mean, there is development happening in Rochdale town centre, but maybe not quite in that kind of front group, but not far behind possibly. Hopefully, so they'll probably move, Michael, at different speeds. Is what I'm saying. And Stockport is moving, and without anything to do with me, I'll be but the interchange in Stockport, I think, would be a big statement of the town centre challenge is actually moving here, because we're aligning our other policies up in the CA around it. The investment of transport capital is starting to kind of feed in here to that. Staley Bridge, as I think, is going to move. There's no question. Prestwich too, I think. So there will be some evidence that the town centre challenge has moved things. Now, whether that's enough, well, everyone will have to decide. I know Lee very well. I think Councillor Walker will back me up in this, in saying that it's been a frustration to us to see a major site in the middle of Lee, the former BICC site, now Bridgewater Business Park, undeveloped for 20 plus, well, certainly as long as I was as MP for Lee. So, that's a long-standing challenge. How quickly can that be moved forward? Well, I don't know, is the honest answer there. So, I wish, and I'd love to see that move quickly, but that's a challenge. One thing just to add to this is it's touched on, Chair, in a number of the reports and in the list. The Cycling and Walking Commissioner, Chris Boardman, and his team have worked pretty quickly in terms of the money they've got under the Transforming Cities Fund. And they will be coming forward quite soon, actually, with the kind of early outline of what they are proposing to do. And in every Town Centre Challenge event, public realm and the kind of quality of life agenda in our towns features very, very prominently. So even though how do you measure the success of the Town Centre Challenge is probably a reasonable question for this committee to ask. Is it in housing units, or is it through delivery of infrastructure? Is it in terms of public opinion, and do people feel those towns are turning the corner? There's a number of ways in which you could judge it, but Chris's team will be, they are prioritising these towns as well, and their early thinking will show that the cycling and walking infrastructure will start to play a part in the creation of a more pleasant public space, so that you then obviously lay the conditions for housing development down the line.
Chris Boardman's coming to the next meeting of this committee. I've got Councillor Booth and then Councillor Dickman, and Fred's waving at me. Councillor Booth.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Andy, at the Communities and Housing Scrutiny in Stockport last week, we were shown some very, very impressive pictures of what this development will look like. It's a very bold initiative, and I've been pushing for us to do more within the town centre, and my hope is it will stimulate the nighttime economy, which has been dead. There's little buds starting to spring up now, more people are starting to go in. The only thing that concerned a few of us, and it was expressed to me, is a possible unintended consequence of gentrification, and a couple of people have expressed that. And I just wonder, have you considered that, and what do we do? Well, it's so difficult to get the balance. I mean, I've talked with the office. It's so difficult to get the balance right. But how do you envisage some of the these unintended consequences and how we would deal with them? Sorry, I know it's a tricky question, but it's something that we've had to think about.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to take 3 questions at once, and if you could answer them all together. Councillor Dickman, please.
Thank you, and thanks, Chair, and thanks, Andy, for the report. Being from Swinton as well, I'm particularly keen to see this going forward in the future. I completely agree with the statement about the move from retail towards leisure and social living. But I wanted to understand more about what support there's going to be for independent shops, independent bars, cultural spaces, rather than just relying on bigger business, bigger shops going forward.
Councillor Walker, a very brief question, if you would.
Yeah. Comment, actually, but one of the unforeseen consequences sometimes, because Lee is our base, but somewhere you know very well, having been our MP for many years. But because people are starting to understand the idea of living in our towns, we are starting to get, so Andy will know it, but right in the centre of town we've got Turnpike House, an eyesore, which I know one of Andy's thought processes was we'd love to see the back of that and something worth having in its place. And unfortunately, it's starting to change, and it's being converted, and there's nothing we can do about it, into shoddy flats. And that sort of consequence, sometimes it might be a precursor to what we envisage, but it actually slows it down, because once you've got shoddiness in an area, it's quite hard to get developers to spend money on something really worthwhile. So it's one of these dilemmas, and it does remind you that these things are not always in our hands. We can work at making them happen, but I mean, in Stockport, I'm guessing, because what I know, the area of Stockport, it's the old railway land at the back and all the sort of stuff around it. I don't know, but that's what I'm assuming it is. And that land is probably slightly easier because it's in probably just a couple of 2 or 3 ownerships, rather than in multiple ownerships, which you sometimes get in some of our town centres.
Would you like to respond to those three, please?
Well, they're three great questions. So, Councillor Booth, your question, I think you're asking the right question. And I think, if we're honest, that charge is levelled sometimes at the city centre, isn't it? You know, and I think that's a real problem. The spatial framework can do something about this, and Paul Dennett was talking to you about ambitions around affordability and stronger statements and policies to support affordability, which in part can address what you're saying. But I think you're right. You're definitely right to be worrying about that. I was on a field trip in New York last year, and there's something called the High Line. I don't know if people are familiar with this, but this is a old railway that runs down the Lower East Side of New York, a raised railway. And it was kind of turned over to a community garden. You know, it's very, very attractive space, but it's completely gentrified the whole area now. And it's, you know, it was a poor community, and now it's just, you know, and that's the danger, isn't it, with you know, getting rid of the shoddiness, to use Fred's word. You know, yes, you can lift an area, but you can also then almost take it away from the community that had it before. And I think this will need to be watched, and you know, and the spatial framework, I think, needs to touch on this issue. I think, you know, maybe we'll take that point back today and recognise it as an issue, because, you know, I don't think we want it to be the case that this is about taking towns off some people and giving them to other people. You know, that isn't, and that wouldn't be success for the town centre challenge. But I'm glad that you see but it looks so attractive that immediately people can worry about gentrification, and maybe that's a good thing, you know, because it looks so impressive, and then people can see that straight away that it's, you know, it's going to succeed, and I hope that's certainly the case. But there are things we can do, I think, to guard against what you're worried about. Councillor Dickman's point is a very important one, because the town centre challenge events have never just been about getting developers in a room. They are partly about getting developers in the room, but we've had the Arts Council at some of our events. We've had Canals and Rivers Trust. We've had Chris Boardman's team at our events. Heritage Lottery Fund, I think, have been to one or two. So it is for me, it's, you know, that you've got to, if you make something attractive at the heart of the town, then the housing comes from that. So it was what I was saying before about the decent cycling infrastructure, and I'm going to touch on Fred's point in a minute, because I think this links to it too. You know, if you create something where people want to be and use, then you create a place where the housing will succeed, and you create value that developers will then see a value, and then you'll make it more attractive for them to go. So some of this is, you know, when we did the walk around of Swinton with the city mayor and the team and the chief executive, I think, you know, the intention is to replace some of the civic amenities, leisure centre, isn't it, is the thinking. And it's that mix, I think, is crucial. If this is to be a success, that will make it work. Fred, on your point, I agree, you know, and I know exactly the building you're talking about. As you say, it is an eyesore. And if you look at what it replaced in the 50s and 60s, it's criminal, actually, in the buildings that were dragged down to make way for it. But this is the bit that's in the hands of districts and not so much in the hands, in my hands, and that is, there are CPO powers now, you know, vested in this office and this building, and it's for districts. You know, we've used them, I think, once. Am I right, Simon? Something in relation to Pomona, I think it was. They were used, and this was when Tony was interim mayor, or even before that. I don't. Interim mayor. When Tony was interim mayor, so they have been used once, I think. The question is, you know, do people want to explore them being used more broadly to clear, you know, because in that case of that building, I think there is a case just to drag it down, put some green space and benches and open up the town and make it create an attractive heart of the town. And then, as I say, the value then comes around that attractive space. So I think in some ways it's not for us, though, to dictate that. You know, the request has to come bottom up rather than us saying, oh, do you know what, we should CPO. You know, that is properly for districts to determine. But the powers are definitely there.
Thank you very much for that update. We look forward to future updates of future progress.
Yeah, it was noted earlier.
While we've got you, one of the items that we have later on our agenda is the work programme. I know that whoever manages your social media account is busy regarding Northern Rail at the moment. And given that this is the Transport Scrutiny Committee, I'm minded to suggest to the committee, when the item comes up later, that we invite somebody from Northern to come to our next meeting. We may or may not have more or less luck than the Today programme and various other people may have. And I wondered if you wanted to take this opportunity to say anything on that, or if you thought there was a better suggestion for us to try and apply pressure via this committee. We next meet in a month's time.
No, I think you certainly should invite them to attend the committee. I mean, it's a chaotic state of affairs. Apportioning where blame truly lies is difficult, if we're honest. You know, there is no doubt that Network Rail bear a considerable part of the responsibility for the situation that we're in. So maybe you might think about the two of them and make them argue it out, because I think that needs to happen. You know, you can't have a rail industry that kind of is deflecting and blame shifting. But Northern, in my view, are culpable too. The service wasn't good enough before the new timetable. You know, people will know from their constituents you've had complaints for over a long period of time. So I think what you had was a poor service that then hit this problem and just didn't have the resilience at all to cope with it. But their communications with the public were woeful. So as things were going downhill, there was no communication. Even now, there's been no substantial offer of compensation or of redress in terms of tickets being able to be used on other services. The Transport for the North Board will say something more about this later today, of which I am now a member, and we've been pushing for them to take a firm view on these things. I think it would be a very good thing to do, Chair, because I don't think this chaos is going to subside anytime soon. And I think we now need to take finally, Northern train issues are on the national agenda. That's a good thing in my view. And I think through this process, it's not about point scoring. It's not about kind of scalps, and I don't see it that way personally. It's about sorting things out and ensuring that we are given the attention that we deserve as a transport system. So I think it would be a very good thing if you were to do that, because the problems are still likely to be going on, sadly.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to welcoming you again to future meetings of this committee. With the agreement of the committee, I'm going to extend this meeting because we've already passed the time we were supposed to finish. So if everybody agrees, we're going to extend this, but keep in mind that many of us will have other meetings this afternoon. So let's march apace through item number 13, introduction of a zonal fare structure on the Metrolink network. I'm hoping these two people are Stephen Rhodes and Gareth Turner. Well done. Excellent. Please go ahead. Please bear in mind we've received the report, we've read it, so as brief as you can, please.
Yeah. Back again on the 12th of July to your next meeting, so it's a bit of a double header. Although I'm on leave, then Gareth will be here. Gareth is our head of fares and ticketing. We're not going to use slides, as you say. You've obviously read the report. I think it's probably fair to say, in terms of where we're coming from, the Metrolink system, great success though it is, has a fairly complex charging structure with over 4,500 individual point-to-point, stop-to-stop fares that have historically developed as the network's grown over time. That's pretty unusual for a metro or a tram system in this country, or indeed further afield. So what we're seeking to do, which is in line with the 2040 transport strategy that the CA has, is to bring about a much simpler, more convenient, and we believe better value for money way of charging for Metrolink, and that's the zonal fares proposal that you've got in front of you, and the report that was considered by the CA back on the 25th of May. Perhaps a couple of quick points just to make at this point that aren't in the report. Metrolink, again, fairly unusual as the type of operation it is, doesn't receive public subsidy on an operational basis, so it has to cover its costs entirely, unlike, for example, a heavy rail system such as Northern you've just been talking about. So we have to make sure that by whatever means we charge, we can cover the costs and pay off the borrowing to expand the system, which is, you know, a very big factor actually, as some members may already be aware. So it's a big step to change the fare system in that sense, because it has a financial impact as well as on customers. It's also worth saying that for the first time in just over 4 years, in January this year, we did put the fares up, and there will be 3 ongoing years of fare rises to recoup the lost revenue over that period. So this zonal proposal is absolutely not about, in itself, putting fares up and raising income in itself, but inherently in there is the second of those 3 years where we are putting fares up to recoup the period where we didn't do that before. That's quite a difficult message for us to get across, which is why I'm sort of stressing it now. And in fact, we think that in some respects, the zonal fare proposal lessens the level of increase that would otherwise be the case. But all being well, if this goes through in early 2019, we would bring zonal fares in. We would have contactless payment as well, with capping for journeys on the Metrolink system, but there would be the second year of those fares increase to go in place, which I think is worth being aware of. So very briefly, in terms of what you see before you, it's a 4-ringed system. We have brought hard copies, A3 hard copies of the map, the proposed zonal map, which we've developed. That replaces, as I say, this very complex fare banding system that we've got in place. But equally, we're trying to make sure that we sort of smooth the way in here, and we do base the new approach on the sort of charging band system, which is inherently in the current system. We would replace return fares with daily travel cards with unlimited travel, which is the reference I made to better value for money, because you'd be able to make more journeys, for example, on the same day without being charged again. It's more flexible, because at the present time you have to buy travel between 2 fixed points, even though you may not be going back to exactly the same stop, for example. So obviously it's restrained a bit by whichever zone you're travelling in, but it's more flexible. And we've also tried very hard, Gareth here particularly, to make sure that certain stops are proposed to be on various boundaries. You'll see they're actually located on a boundary, so they would be valid for journey into the city centre if they're in one direction, or outward in another direction. We can explain that a little bit more if you want. There's a map, and as I say, we've got hard copies of a larger version of that. It's quite difficult, given the shape of the network, to fit it onto a page and make it sensible for people. But really, just finishing off from me, and then we're keen to get member input, really. We have just launched the public engagement that was ratified by the Combined Authority. We started that last Friday. I'm pleased to say that by last night we'd had well over 1,000 people responded online to the fares survey, which we're really encouraged by. We haven't looked into that 1,000, so I can't give you any idea, because I don't know myself yet, as to what they're actually saying to us. But the level of engagement really encouraging, and we want people to comment by the 17th of June. So there's a fairly short window for people to comment, and the timing of this meeting is obviously really useful for that. And when we come back in July, when Gareth comes back in July, we'll be able to say a bit more about what people have told us in that engagement, prior to then going back to the Combined Authority with a detailed proposal. But this does link to a pretty major change, linked to contactless payment, capping, a much more, if you like, London-like approach to how we charge for Metrolink. As I say, in itself, the zonal system is not about putting fares up. One or two of the comments I think we're likely to get to that it's a fares increase by the back door or so on. There was already a fares increase approved before, but actually the zonal fare system, if anything, makes it slightly better news. So I'll perhaps leave it at that. Gareth or I, very happy to take questions from you, Chair.
Okay, I'll start, because I think I understood you to say that the public engagement started on Friday and finishes in 2.5 weeks.
Does, yeah. 17th, yeah.
On the 17th.
17th, that's right.
Could you explain why a 2.5-week period is acceptable for public engagement on a change to a service that is there for the public? And just something else about public engagement, the website that currently exists doesn't appear to allow, I may have not been able to find it, doesn't appear to allow residents or passengers to check the changes to their fares for a route that they typically take. It seems to be a little bit clumsy in that way. So if you could talk about that public engagement first, and then I'll take comments from around the room.
Thank you. Well, we've certainly tried with the public engagement to be very open, so all the fares, and Gareth may just want to comment in a moment, but we've put all of the proposed fares, and it's a much simpler fares system, onto there for people to be able to be entirely transparent about that. the matter about consultation and a formal consultation versus public engagement is where we do really want, and the Mayor, for example, is very keen to get the level of input. We're also driven around the timescales by which, if you like, there's an opportunity to make this change alongside putting contactless in place in early 2019. It's a very complex area to implement and to change all fares in that way. There's a lot of development work to take place. So the reality is, if we were to bring those two things in together, and there's an if because it doesn't have to be the case, but it would make sense, and it would make sense in terms of customer messaging as well, that we'd make all of those changes at the same time in early 2019. So frankly, a formal consultation period would run much longer, and we would be trying to implement contactless fares change then and zonal to different timescales, which is really, really complex in messaging terms. So that's really why I'm saying that in a pretty focused period of time, and anybody that has the TFGM or Metrolink Twitter feed will see that I think we're on the verge of about however many notifications we can actually put out on that over the weekend and this morning. But we're really trying hard. There are posters out there. We're doing a radio in the hot seat on Radio Manchester next week specifically on this topic. So I do recognise it's a short period, but we want to make sure that as many people as possible get the chance to input. You know, we don't know what people will come up with, what sorts of comments. That's one of the things about this type of engagement. But we've obviously got systems in place to record that. There's the actual survey form has quite a few free text fields, so people can actually make comments, not just choices, if you like. And we want to make sure we gather as much information as possible in what I agree is a fairly focused period of time. I don't know, Gareth, whether you wanted to comment on the point about what fares information is available.
I suppose I do take your point on board. What we have made available is all the information that people will need to compare their 2018 fares, the fares that they currently pay, to the fares that they would pay under a zonal fare structure, so under the proposal in early 2019. What we haven't made available, and for good reason, which I'll come on to, are the fares that people would pay if we didn't go ahead with the proposal, so if we kept the current system in January 2019. The reason for doing that is that there are, as Stephen says, over 4,500 fares available per product. Multiply that by 8 products, you have an incredible large range of fares in the current system. The fare increase for January 2019 is July RPI plus 1 plus 1.3%. We obviously don't know what July RPI is yet. Also, because we're restricted to 20 pence increments on all of the tickets, and the reason for that is that child fares and concessionary fares are set at 50% of the adult fare. The TVM machines don't accept any denomination of coin less than 10 pence. Therefore, adult fares have to increase by 20 pence. Goes without saying. Because of that, the way that we approach the fare increase is we put up all those fares that are restricted by that 20 pence increment, and then we adjust the other fares to balance the overall fare increase, so we achieve an average of RPI plus 1 plus 1.3%. If we were to publish that in advance of knowing July RPI, we would be committing to those fares, and in some cases that would be disadvantageous to residents of Greater Manchester. So the step we've taken, because we've done the modelling under the proposal, is to say absolutely we know what the fares will be under the proposal. We've made those available absolutely transparently, such that people can compare their current fares with those fares. But we can't for a couple of months say exactly what the individual fares will be in 2019 if the proposal doesn't go ahead. What we can say is that they will increase on average by RPI plus 1 plus 1.3%, which is assumed to be about 5.4%. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, it does. So I'm interested in your use of the word focused to describe a fortnight, 2.5 weeks for public engagement, and it was interesting for you to put some colour on that as to doing radio and Twitter and so on. Is there a reason why it was chosen to be 2.5 weeks? Because I'm guessing this isn't just a plan that you've knocked up over the last couple of weeks. It's been in the making for some time, I would guess. Why was a longer period of public engagement not chosen?
So we have been working on this for quite a considerable period of time, as probably is evident, because I've also said we need to make sure we get it right and make sure it's entirely the right thing to do. So there are two reasons for that. When we engaged with the Mayor regarding this, he was very keen there was a level of engagement about that. And I think the other answer is the comment I've made about the fact that there's to actually pull all of these measures together, because we're very keen for people to get the benefits, for example, of contactless as soon as possible. That to do that in a coordinated way without confusing people out there, that's another reason to do it and get a decision in July. Otherwise, we're trying to make very significant changes, including software changes, well into the autumn, the back end of this calendar year, and potentially then implement them in January. And we need a time period to be able to work that through.
So my question wasn't why did it finish? Why is it going to finish on that date? It was why didn't it start earlier?
Okay, I've tried to answer that in the context of we sort of planned to do that level of engagement from about 4 or 5 weeks ago now. So there's been a lot of work go on to get it to this stage and to get a specialist website that's there now. To be able to Twitter it and so on. To have started that at that earlier stage would have meant the whole thing running far in advance, and it being implicit there would be a consultation from the very beginning, and that wasn't part of our initial plan.
Okay. I've got Councillor Robinson, and if other members could indicate if they want to speak. I've got Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Now, that's my transport for bus and Metrolink. Which I can't use before 9:30, so I have to pay for a taxi to get me to the Metrolink in the first place. Then I have to wait till 9:30 before I can come to a meeting. My issue is that going to change at all when the fares go up? Will we be classed as being able to use it all zones? And also, when the costs are going up, is it just to pay for your new software, or will it be also to improve some of the stations?
Okay, so to answer your first point, absolutely, you will still be able to use, and anyone in possession of a concessionary travel pass will still be able to use it in exactly the same way that they currently use it within Greater Manchester. The reason for the 9:30 restriction on the these people of state pension age, wherever we are at now with it, concessionary pass, is that we receive national funding for use of that concessionary travel pass on buses. The extension of it to rail and to tram within Greater Manchester is locally funded. So to the extent that we were to extend that for travel pre-9:30, we would have to find that funding either from within the local authorities or by diverting it from other resources that we spend as Transport for Greater Manchester.
Can I come in
yep.
a minute, please? It's not because I'm a Councillor Robinson.
So, apologies. Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's not because I'm a pensioner, it's because I have disabilities. Like many other people that work with disabilities, they are charged before they go in the morning, before 9:30, you know, even though they have a concessionary pass for disabilities. That was my point.
Yeah. And it is a local concession, and the concessionary fare will increase in line with the other fare increases, but not over and above those. So to the extent that it's 50% of the current adult fare, it will remain to be 50% of that level. Yeah.
And perhaps just to pick up the comment in terms of what it will fund, I mean, it needs to cover the operational costs for the maintenance of the network and the upkeep of the stops. So it's no more than a replacement method of being able to do that. And in fact, and it's in the report that went to the CA, we will actually need to generate more passengers, approximately 2.5% more, to be able to ensure that we can get the same revenue as we do now, which I think further supports the fact this is not in itself about a fares increase.
It's a bugbear of mine, and it has been from the last 12 months, actually. The times I've been stuck at Bury Station, or I can't get up the escalator when the lift's not working, or both aren't working, and then being stranded at Radcliffe because we're told you can't go any further because you can't get into Bury if you're disabled. That's been ongoing now for nearly 2 years. And when I do the winter ones, and it's dark at night and it's cold, and you're left stranded at a station because you can't get up them stairs, I'm hoping that this year, Bury Metrolink station will be up and running properly. Please.
It's about the escalator. That's the point about the access and the escalator and the repairs that are happening later this month and into early July. But I agree they've taken far too long.
Councillor Robinson talks about an important subject for this committee that we have visited before, and I really hope that the committee agrees to visit it again. I think, as nobody else has indicated, Councillor Morgan, very quickly, please.
Could you give this committee that it's not going to turn into utter chaos like the Northern Rail episode? Just what testing we doing with regard to contactless? We've just had the visa thing collapse and people can't pay for the shopping. So what assurance can you give it's going to go live?
I'll take it. So the contactless work is a separate piece of work from the zonal proposal, which started about 6 months ago. We, TFGM, as many other organisations, have learned from previous projects, and the general trend in the project world is to move to a more agile delivery approach. So rather than setting a kind of an end goal, which is big, you launch everything on a certain date and you do all your testing at once. It's based on a much more incremental approach. So the approach we're taking to delivering contactless payment on Metrolink is based on that basis. We are currently in a pilot phase. So that pilot phase is a small number of people within TFGM using a small number of validators, so the yellow sort of pylons across the network that you touch on with your concessionary pass. And they are basically touching on with their contactless bank cards. No payment is being taken, but at the moment, the step that we're in, it's basically making sure that the software works. The next stage will be a pilot where a small group of people use it in exactly the same way, but payment is turned on, so it checks that it's communicating correctly with the banks. There'll then be a beta phase, so a larger pilot, which will be extended beyond Transport for Greater Manchester, but still within the GM family. And then we will get to a point of launch back end of this year, which will be the public launch. So we've learned from previous kind of projects, as other organisations have, and we are taking steps to move to an approach which increases the chances of, or reduces the chances of failure.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. Thank you both very much for that. We'd like to encourage more public engagement when any changes are planned, I think just as a general vibe. So we've got two further items. One, date and time of next meeting, item 15. Hopefully everybody agrees with that. It's the 12th of July at 6 p.m. On the work programme, just because of the time we've taken of this meeting, I just want us to agree what's on our next meeting's agenda. We've got the cycling and walking update. Chris Boardman, the Commissioner, is planning to come and see us. I hope members agree that that should be on the agenda. The Green Summit Springboard report. This is a follow-up for the Greater Manchester Green Summit, which took place in the last municipal year. I wonder if that might be a written report rather than somebody coming to present. The reason why we've had four substantive items on this agenda, and it's been too many today. We talked about adding an item on trains, on Northern and Network Rail coming to see us, and that seemed to have nodding around the room, so I hope that we agree with that. And the other item that we've had as a standing item is the GMSF, Susan. Bearing in mind the next version of the GMSF is due to go to the Combined Authority meeting in July, I wonder if we might have some information about the plans for the consultation with the public, because that's something I think this committee could really add value to. So we're not commenting on the report, we're not commenting on the, I don't want them building on my green belt. It's very much how is the Combined Authority going to engage with the public on such a big issue for the Combined Authority. So if members agree with that, I propose that we bring the work programme back to the next meeting of this committee. And if any member has any subject within the remit of this committee that they'd like to see on a future agenda, please contact Susan, and I'm sure she'd be delighted to go through that with you. On that basis, I'll draw the meeting to a close. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just before you leave, can I just ask, like, if you would be okay about doing an hour before the next meeting as a kind of an induction, a bit more of